Chapter 13a, the spinal cord. In this lecture, we'll talk about testing the knee-jerk reflex. We'll ask, why do we bother testing it in the first place? And why does the human body have this reflex? We'll talk about spinal shock and ask why paramedics might test the knee-jerk reflex after determining that a person can move and feel all parts of their body. We'll talk about carpal tunnel syndrome and why it has its own particular pattern of numbness and pain. Similarly, we can discuss sciatica. Lastly, we'll talk about interneurons. Some reflexes have them, but not all. So we should ask, why do some need interneurons and others not? To do that, we'll need to talk about some basic anatomy of the spine first, discussing the gray matter and the white matter, and then we'll talk about the connective tissues surrounding the spine. Then we'll talk about these strange things called dermatomes, and some even stranger things called plexuses, before moving on to a number of reflexes. The spinal cord is highly organized. Sensory information always enters dorsally, and motor information exits ventrally. White matter is superficial to gray matter. The left and right sides of gray matter are connected to each other by the gray commissure. And then there are three horns of gray matter. A pair of dorsal horns where sensory information enters, a pair of ventral horns where the motor information exits, and in some regions a pair of lateral horns which are associated with the autonomic nervous system. Surrounding the spine are three layers of connective tissue which protect the spinal cord. These will be the same layers of connective tissue surrounding the brain in the next lecture. The deepest is a very thin layer of connective tissue that touches the spine, called the pia mater. Superficial to that is the arachnoid mater, and the most superficial is the dura mater. This is the thickest and the toughest of the three connective tissue layers. Superficial to this is a space called the epidural space, which usually has adipose tissue and some other loose connective tissues. When anesthetics are injected into this space, they diffuse around the spine very quickly and can provide good anesthesia, blocking all signals from traveling upwards or downwards from the spot of injection. One other very relevant space is the subarachnoid space. A spiderweb-like network of collagen fibers helps to keep this open, and it is full of cerebrospinal fluid. An infection in this area is called meningitis. This is a very serious condition because inflammation can trigger swelling, which can push on the brain or spine, causing permanent damage. There's only a few bacteria, viruses, or fungi that cause meningitis. It's tricky to get here because it's behind the blood-brain barrier, but that also makes it very difficult to treat. The basic organization of the spine was that gray matter was deep to white matter. The white matter consists of myelinated axons, either traveling down from the brain or up towards the brain. The gray matter consists of interneurons, as well as the cell bodies and dendrites of some of the neurons traveling upwards or downwards. The cell bodies found in the gray matter are highly organized. Those related to sensory neurons are in the dorsal horns. Those related to motor neurons are in the ventral horns. Interneurons, also found in the gray matter, may connect some of the sensory inputs to the motor outputs, circumventing the brain and triggering a reflex. The white matter is also highly organized. There are groups of axons on the posterior side traveling upwards towards the brain called posterior columns. There are ventral columns traveling downwards from the brain, and on the sides are the lateral columns. We could further subdivide the columns into different tracts or individual bundles of axons. Indeed, such maps exist, but I'm not going to cover them. Instead, I would like you to understand the basic concept. There's a saying in neurobiology that neurons that fire together wire together. And that means that neurons that serve similar functions tend to be next to one another. And that's what we see in the white matter. Axons traveling down to the brain to control certain muscles are bundled together in the ventral columns. Axons traveling up to the brain, sending sensory information, are bundled into tracks in the dorsal columns. In the gray matter, we find the cell bodies of a bunch of neurons. In the central nervous system, you can call these nuclei, or you can call them ganglia. Out in the peripheral nervous system, we typically only call them ganglia. From here on out, I'm only going to use the word ganglia, and if I mention a nucleus, I'm talking about the place where a cell keeps its DNA. For instance, the dorsal root ganglia are structures in the peripheral nervous system that contain cell bodies of sensory neurons, as well as the satellite cells surrounding them. That's the basic anatomy of the spinal cord. It's fairly straightforward. Next up, let's talk about peripheral structures. Connecting to the spinal cord are dorsal roots. These contain axons of sensory neurons. Their nucleuses are all located in two dorsal root ganglia off to either side. The ventral roots contain the axons of just motor neurons. The cell bodies of these motor neurons are in the ventral horn. The two roots come together to form a spinal nerve. This nerve contains both sensory and motor information. In fact, the only place we're going to see just sensory or just motor out in the peripheral nervous system are in these roots. Otherwise, everything else that I'm going to talk about has both sensory and motor neurons in it. The spinal nerves aren't very long, though. They quickly split into a pair of ramuses. One goes to the dorsal side of the body. It's called the dorsal ramus. And another one goes to the ventral side of the body. It's called the ventral ramus. This one also connects to the limbs. Therefore, it's much larger than the dorsal ramus, as it controls a lot more muscles and has a lot more skin to provide sensory information back to the brain. Here in this slice through the human body, we can see the dorsal ramus controls the muscles and the skin in this region. This is the area of the body that the ventral ramus is responsible for. And coming up, we'll see that the rami communicantes controls all of the stuff internally. This rami communicantes is part of the autonomic nervous system. It's a third ramus that's going to connect to the sympathetic chain ganglia. The axons in this ramus are connected to my visceral organs. Therefore, we have three ramuses: a small dorsal ramus, a larger ventral ramus, and that deeper rami communicantes. All of the sensory neurons in any of these ramuses travel up the dorsal root to connect to the dorsal horn. So if you were to touch me on my back, there's an axon that travels up the dorsal ramus, but it continues up the dorsal root. If you were to tickle my belly, I've got an axon that travels up the ventral ramus and continues up the dorsal root. And if my stomach was full, I have a third axon that travels up the rami communicantes and then up the dorsal root. All three of these pieces of information are sensory, therefore they all travel up the dorsal root. But because they come from three very different locations, the axons extended down a different ramus. To summarize, the dorsal roots were strictly sensory, the ventral roots were strictly motor, but the spinal nerve and the ramuses were a mixture of both sensory and motor information. The rami communicantes was special in that it was autonomic. The dorsal and ventral ramus were part of the somatic nervous system. That's some of the basics of the peripheral nervous system, right next to the spine. Next up, let's talk more about these spinal nerves. They exit the spinal column in left and right pairs, exiting between the vertebrae. Therefore, I've got one more spinal nerve than I do vertebrae. Nerves are surrounded by 3 layers of connective tissue. The epineurium is the connective tissue that you find on the very outside of the nerve. The perineurium surrounds individual fascicles of axons, and endoneurium is the stuff that you find in between neurons. This is very similar in name and location to the layers of connective tissue around a muscle. And that's not by accident. The human body often reuses basic patterns over and over again to cut down on the amount of information that it has to store. Axons are bundled together in a highly organized fashion. As I mentioned earlier, neurons that fire together wire together. That means they like to stick to one another. This helps to prevent the condition known as spaghetti, that if you've ever had to deal with a large number of wires, you may be aware of what this is like. We have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. This means there's one more spinal nerve than we have vertebrae. They're given numbers for the vertebrae that they are near, but we had one extra. So if you remember your breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, dinner at 5 from last quarter, we added an 8th to that breakfast number, but the other 2 are just the same. Each of these spinal nerves connects to a specific region of skin, and this region of skin is called a dermatome. Damage to one spinal nerve would cause paralysis and numbness in this one dermatome. We would call this a peripheral neuropathy, or the loss of information and control in a specific band of the human body. This damage could be permanent or temporary. When it happens, we call it a palsy. It could be caused by the blockage of blood. For instance, you fell asleep in class, and when you woke up, your arm was asleep. That's temporary and should return to normal once blood flow resumes. But for a while, because of the lack of oxygen, those neurons will not have enough ATP to keep their sodium-potassium pumps running. Therefore, they will not be able to fire action potentials. That means that limb is going to be weaker for a while and also numb. If this is your face, we would call it a facial palsy. And this gentleman over here is showing the classical sign of what's called Bell's palsy. So take a look at him and ask which side of his face is partially paralyzed. And it's actually his right side. We have asked him to smile, and only one side of his face is able to comply. The facial nerve on the other side is not relaying this information to his muscles properly. This would be a more permanent condition and can be caused by a stroke. Chickenpox is caused by a virus that can insert its DNA into the nucleuses of neurons. After the virus has been wiped out, the instructions for making new virus particles still exist in the dorsal root ganglia. And for reasons that aren't fully understood, years later, this DNA can suddenly be transcribed and translated into new viruses. Because of the connective tissue surrounding the nerve, these virus particles will really only be able to travel in one direction, and that's down the nerve. They can spread outwards much more slowly due to the dense collagen fibers of the epineurium. For this reason, shingles will tend to follow a dermatome. The eruption travels down the dermatome very quickly, but spreads outwards much more slowly. Next, we need to cover the nerve plexuses. It turns out that some spinal nerves don't simply travel to a dermatome. Instead, they join up with other spinal nerves and then split apart. and then join again, and then split apart, and then travel to one of the limbs or elsewhere. The four major plexuses are the cervical, the brachial, the lumbar, and the sacral plexus. Although depending on which book you read, some books will lump these two together as the lumbosacral plexus. If you take a look at pictures or the models in lab, that should make sense as to why some people do that. The cervical plexus exists up in the neck, as hopefully you already suspected. There's a major nerve that comes off of this called the phrenic nerve, which controls the diaphragm. There's one on the left and one on the right that each control half. Next up is the brachial plexus. This plexus connects to the arms. It's here that I'd like to discuss why we have these plexuses at all. You'll notice up here that there are 5 spinal nerves exiting the spinal cord and 5 major nerves in the arm. Why not just have each of the 5 spinal nerves connect to one of the 5 major nerves in the arm and skip all of this branching and networking business? The reason for that is, let me give you an example. The thumb is controlled primarily by the radial nerve. If I were to damage that nerve, I wouldn't be able to use my thumb. And if I couldn't use my thumb, I couldn't grip anything. And if I couldn't grip anything, then my entire arm would kind of be useless. So to prevent that from happening, I instead distribute control of the thumb over all 5 of the spinal nerves, so that if I damage one of them, rather than paralyzing a region of my arm, I lose about 20% of the strength over my entire arm. And that's something that the brain can compensate for. It'll just send a stronger signal down the other 4 nerves to compensate. And maybe I won't be able to lift as heavy of an object, but for everything else that's not the absolute heaviest thing that I'm trying to lift, I'll be just fine. So these plexuses are redundant pathways that prevent paralysis over a broad region of a limb and instead distribute any damage over a much broader area. Two of those 5 nerves went just to the arm. The other 3 travel all the way down to the hand. One of those is the median nerve. Please keep in mind the letter N here. It is not medial. The most medial portion is actually your pinky. We're talking about the part in the middle of the hand. This nerve travels through the middle, and because it goes through a tiny little tunnel here next to all of your carpal bones and some big tendons, if this gets compressed and inflamed, it can damage the nerve, causing paralysis, numbness, and pain in a very specific region of the hand. Because we know exactly where the median nerve connects, we can test for carpal tunnel syndrome fairly easily. If you were to poke somebody with a pin here, and they couldn't feel it, and they couldn't feel it here, and they couldn't feel it here, and they couldn't feel it on this side of the finger, but they could on that side, and they could also feel it when you poked them on this finger, that would be a distinct sign that they've gotten damage to their median nerve. Next up is the lumbosacral plexus. There are 2 major nerves that come off of this plexus. The most superior one is the femoral nerve. Down more inferiorly, the sciatic nerve comes off. The sciatic nerve travels all the way down the leg. For some people, the sciatic nerve travels through the piriformis muscle. If this muscle tenses or cramps up, it can pinch on the nerve, causing a palsy, pain, and numbness traveling all the way down that leg. Massage on the piriformis muscle can alleviate these symptoms fairly easily, effectively, and cheaply. This is often called piriformis syndrome, although some people reserve that name for a related condition that involves scarring of the piriformis muscle and is not so easily treatable with massage. For most other people with sciatica, however, this is not the cause of their symptoms, and their sciatica is going to be much harder to treat. Those are the connective tissues, the dermatomes, and the plexuses. So we had 4 major plexuses, and they provided redundant pathways to some very important locations: my arms, my legs, and my diaphragm muscle. Next up, let's discuss neuronal pools. I like teaching the spinal cord right after learning about neurons, and that's because the spinal cord has neurons organized together into very simple networks. Simple enough that we can pick a few to look at and understand how they work. And if we understand how they work in the spine, we could at least in theory understand how much more complicated networks behave up in the brain. But let's start simple. On the right-hand side of the page, you see some basic patterns of how neurons are connected in the spine and brain. These pools can be divergent, convergent, connected serially or in parallel, and they can even reverberate back to an original neuron. Take some time to look at these and see if the names make sense to you. Memorizing these names won't make us any smarter, but we will see these patterns over the next few days. The spinal column has some very simple networks of neurons that mediate reflexes. At the very minimum, a reflex must involve a sensory neuron that brings in some sort of information. Optionally, there may be interneurons which can change this information, but then we must also have at least one motor neuron which controls the behavior. The simplest of the reflexes is the patellar reflex, or the knee-jerk reflex. There is only one synapse in this reflex, so it occurs very quickly and consistently. Tapping on the patellar tendon will activate dendrites that will interpret this as a stretch action. An action potential will travel up the dorsal root into the dorsal horn, and this axon extends all the way to the ventral horn, where it synapses on a motor neuron. Activation of this motor neuron will trigger an action potential that exits via the ventral root and travels all the way back to this muscle, causing contraction of that muscle. Therefore, what started off as detection of a stretch has led to the opposite, a contraction. One of the reasons that our body has this type of reflex, and it's not just in the patellar tendon, it's in many of our muscles, is to aid in posture. Whenever we lean to one side, the muscles will get stretched on one side of our body. This reflex would cause them to contract and automatically bring us back to an upright position. This allows us to maintain balance without having to use brain space to calculate what to do. We have the patellar reflex, which is one of our stretch reflexes to aid in posture. The other major function of these reflexes is to protect muscles. If a muscle were to get stretched too much, it could tear the muscle or the tendons attached to it. Therefore, this reflex will cause any muscle that's getting overstretched to contract and resist that stretching. This helps to protect our muscles. But that's not why we test this reflex. We wouldn't miss it too much if it were absent. However, because this reflex can be tested non-invasively, and because it is so consistent, it is very useful to us. If it was diminished or damaged, that could be a sign of a neurodegenerative disease. And we like to treat these types of diseases earlier rather than later. It's nice to have a reflex that is consistent. It should behave the same way on the left side of the body as the right side. We wouldn't want to rely on more complicated behaviors. For instance, how many times did you forget your car keys this week? Was it more than last week? Was it more than the week before? Did you forget where you put your car keys more than 3 times? And if so, is that a sign that you're coming down with Alzheimer's disease? No, by testing a more consistent reflex, we can get a much more accurate measurement. All of the other reflexes have interneurons, and therefore are more complicated than the stretch reflex. For instance, the withdrawal reflex will get us to move a part of the body away from a painful stimulus. To do this quickly, I want to flex the muscles that retract that part of my body, but relax the muscles that were moving it towards the source of pain in the first place. So I need to mediate 2 behaviors on opposite sides of the limb. To do this is going to require an interneuron. And that's because neurons only release one neurotransmitter. And neurotransmitters tend to be excitatory or inhibitory. So I can't release the same neurotransmitter onto 2 motor neurons and expect opposite behaviors. I'm going to need an interneuron in here somewhere. So I will have 2 motor neurons, but my sensory neuron will also connect to an interneuron. And let's see what happens now. I've got some sort of stimulus again, picked up at the dendrites of a sensory neuron. This may be a pain neuron now. This action potential travels up the dorsal root, and at the axon terminals, we release the same neurotransmitter, stimulating motor neuron number 1 and the interneuron. Motor neuron number 1 does exactly what we did before. It's going to cause this muscle to contract and start pulling us away from the painful stimulus. The interneuron also gets activated, but this interneuron is going to release a different neurotransmitter, one that causes an IPSP on the postsynaptic cell. So while the motor neuron is activating the muscle that causes us to withdraw from the stimulus, the interneuron is inhibiting the other motor neuron, the one that controls the muscle that is the antagonist in this situation. So while one muscle is contracting, the opposite muscle should be relaxing. So for any behavior that's more complicated than our stretch reflex is going to involve at least one interneuron. This leads us to the next topic. What if I wanted to flex my biceps? Wouldn't that cause my triceps to stretch? And if so, wouldn't that activate the stretch reflex, causing them to contract? And that's exactly what would happen if we couldn't turn off the stretch reflexes. So whenever we think about flexing our biceps, we will also inactivate the stretch reflex on the triceps. This is called reciprocal inhibition. We have to turn off these reflexes from time to time in order to use our muscles consciously. The next reflex is the crossed extensor reflex. This one involves an ipsilateral response and a contralateral response. That means some information needs to be sent across the gray commissure so that I can have behaviors on both sides of the body. Those behaviors are different, however. If I step on something painful, the leg that is on the same side as the stimulus, the ipsilateral side, will be removed from the stimulus. It will lift. Whereas the contralateral leg will maintain all of our body weight. We have a reverberating circuit here. I keep the leg lifted until my brain decides what to do with it. Otherwise, I just put my foot right back down on the tack and go ouch, and trigger the reflex again, put my foot down, say ouch, lift my leg again, in some sort of Homer Simpson joke. We say ipsilateral and contralateral so that we don't have to say if you step on a tack with your left leg raises, but if you stepped on it with your right leg would raise. This next topic, hyporeflexia, is one of the more complicated topics of this chapter. If I am able to sense a part of my body, that means I have a neuron in a nerve somewhere that is detecting this information and connecting to the dorsal side of my spinal cord. It synapses on another neuron, which travels up a dorsal column to relay this information to my brain. So if I am aware of this information, both of these neurons are healthy. To control a part of my body, I have a neuron whose axon travels down the ventral column and synapses in the ventral horn, and a motor neuron whose axon exits the ventral root to connect to a muscle somewhere. If these two neurons are healthy, then I am able to move this part of my body. I also have interneurons, which can connect the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. If I was in an accident, the paramedic might test whether I can feel all parts of my body. And if I can, it means the sensory neuron in my nerve is okay, and the neuron that it connects to traveling up to my brain is okay. And if I can move all parts of my body, that means all of the axons traveling downwards are okay, and the motor neurons in my nerves are okay. But if I had absent or diminished reflexes, that means there's some damage in the spine. And that damage would be to this interneuron that normally relays the sensory information directly to the motor neuron in a reflex. So again, if I had hyporeflexia, these two neurons are fine. These two neurons are fine. The damage would be somewhere in the gray matter of my spine. I can still move and feel these parts of my body, but my reflexes have been injured. And as we covered in the previous chapter, damage in the spine or any part of the central nervous system is not something that we like to just leave there. It's only going to get worse, and so this needs immediate treatment. That is why the paramedic will also test reflexes when they come upon the scene of an accident victim. Reflexes can be changed by the brain. We can turn them up or down. They do occur automatically, but that doesn't mean they can't be manipulated. The brain can sometimes use these reflexes kind of like subroutines. The brain may want to walk, and that involves maintaining balance. But rather than think about balance, we can rely on the stretch reflexes to do that for us. The brain can reinforce or inhibit reflexes. Let's say you've got a glass-top stove, one that when it reaches a certain temperature no longer glows red, and you're wondering whether it's hot or cold. If you put your hand on the stove, suspecting that it might be hot, you can actually pull your hand away faster. That's because the brain will depolarize the interneurons involved in this reflex, bringing them closer to threshold. Just the initial little bit of heat will tell you you need to pull your hand away, and you do. On the other hand, we can also inhibit our reflexes. For instance, it's very difficult to give yourself a knee-jerk reflex test. That's because you're probably thinking about the tendon as you're trying to hit it. If your patients are thinking about their tendons, you will have to distract them. Maybe give them a math problem to do while you test their reflexes. Lastly, not all of our reflexes are there at birth. Some of them take a while to get wired up properly. The Babinski reflex, or the curling of the toes in response to a pressure along the bottom of the foot, changes in early development. If this change were delayed, it could be a sign of impaired neural development that might need to be treated. Hiccups are another example of a reflex. This involves stimulation of the phrenic nerve that will then trigger muscles controlling the lungs to try and expel some sort of perceived or otherwise noxious substance. Persistent hiccups can be very debilitating. It doesn't happen that often, but when it does, some people are okay with being treated by these very powerful drugs that affect the central nervous system. In fact, there are a lot of people with psychosis who would rather not take haloperidol, so it's pretty surprising that people with persistent hiccups would be okay with this. Those were some of the basic circuits, and those circuits, we talked about some specific reflexes. We had one monosynaptic reflex, the stretch reflex. All of the others were polysynaptic. The stretch reflex was the only one whose anatomy I went over. We covered most of the physiology on these others down here.